Let's move into substance abuse as vice crime. Data on drugs in the U.S. Are available through a variety of sources. According to the National Survey on Drug Use in Health, from their data that was released in 2015, an estimated 27 million Americans aged 12 and older were current users of illicit drugs in the previous year, 2014. The report came out in 2015. Meaning that they used an illicit drug at least once during the 30 days prior to the survey. This estimate represents 10.2% of the population, age 12 and older. The Office of the National Drug Control Policy estimates that Americans annually spend around $103 billion to purchase illegal drugs. The government estimates that the total cost of substance abuse is more than $400 billion each year, with health care costs for substance abuse at about $40 billion. So when did drug use begin? Well, humans have used drugs of one sort or another for thousands of years. Wine was used at least from the time of the early Egyptians, narcotics from 4000 BC, and medicinal use of marijuana has been dated to the 2700 BC in China. But not until the 19th century AD were the active substances in drugs extracted. There followed a time when some of these newly discovered substances, morphine, cocaine, were completely unregulated and prescribed freely by physicians for a wide variety of ailments. They were available in patent medicines and sold by traveling tinkers in drugstores or through the mail. During the American Civil War, morphine was used freely, and wounded veterans returned home with their kits of morphine and hypodermic needles. Opium dens flourished, but by the early 1900s, there were an estimated of 250,000 drug addicts in the United States. Where does it further begin? Alcohol and the law. That's also a controversial topic, or was. The 18th Amendment of the U.S. Constitution, which banned the manufacture, transportation, and sale of intoxicating liquors. This was known as the period in American history as the Prohibition. In the 1820s and 30s, a wave of religious revivalism swept the United States, leading to increased calls for temperance, as well as other perfectionist movements, such as the abolitionist movement to end slavery. In 1838, the state of Massachusetts passed a temperance law banning the sale of spirits in less than 15-gallon quantities. Though the law was repealed 2 years later, it set a precedent for such legislation. Maine passed the first state prohibition laws in 1846, followed by a stricter law in 1851. A number of other states had followed suit by the time the Civil War began in 1861. Prohibition was ratified by the states on January 16, 1919, and officially went into effect on January 17, 2020. Now, this is a federal law. With the passage of the Volstead Act is where that prohibition at the federal level came in. And despite the new legislation, prohibition was difficult to enforce. The increase of the illegal production and sale of liquor, known as bootlegging, the proliferation of illegal drinking spots, in the accompanying rise in gang violence and other crimes led to waning support for prohibition by the end of the 1920s. In early 1933, Congress adopted a resolution proposing a 21st Amendment to the Constitution that would repeal the 18th Amendment, and the 21st Amendment was ratified by all the states on December 5th, 1933, ending the prohibition. So alcohol is clearly legal. There are some states that it's state regulated now, and there are some states where you can't buy alcohol on Sundays. You can't sell it in grocery stores. So all of those laws come from the individual states. So what's our extent? And when we talk about substance abuse, alcohol is included in that discussion. And as we jump back and forth, I'll make the distinction between the two. So what is the extent of substance abuse? Well, according to the federal government, 10%, federal government survey, 10% of Americans used illegal drugs in the past year. That was the number that I just mentioned earlier, based on, that was the survey came out in 2015. The results in 2015 was based on 2014. Looking at the future, monitoring the future, how did substance abuse take part? Drug use declined from its high point. There was a high point in 1980, and it declined until 1990, when it began to increase again until 1996. 1996 seemed to be the peak, because now we're in a decline. Marijuana is the most widely used illicit drug among everybody. About 1/3 of high school seniors report using marijuana the prior year. However, high school teens and seniors, we'll call adolescents, let's say adolescents in general, their drug of choice is actually alcohol. And when I say marijuana is the mostly widely used illicit drug among everyone, I mean 12 and older is the data. According to the National Center on Addiction and Substance Abuse, alcohol abuse begins at an early age. Usually 7, 8-year-olds have reported alcohol use and then it becoming abuse. More than 31.5% of high school students admit to drinking at least once a month. While this is on the decline, alcohol use among adolescents, there is still a problem, especially with heavy drinking. Heavy drinking is reported by 7% of youth 12 and over. That's 17 million people. 2% of youth aged 12 to 17 were heavy drinkers, and 8% engaged in binge drinking. Binge drinking is defined as 5 or more alcoholic drinks on one occasion in the past 30 days. According to one survey, teens who are sexually active are more likely to drink, more likely to get drunk, more likely to have tried marijuana, and more likely to have smoked cigarettes. Teens who spend 25 hours a week or more with boyfriends, girlfriends are more likely to drink, get drunk, and try marijuana, and smoke. Girls with boyfriends 2 or more years older are more likely, their boyfriends are two or more years older than the girls, are likely to drink or get drunk, try marijuana, and to smoke. So the question is, are these surveys accurate? Well, there's generally are. However, drug users may boast about their behaviors. They may lie about their behaviors. They may not want to admit it, or they want to admit it, but maybe it's embellished. And also the survey itself seems to miss some people, like homeless people, people who are in prison, people who might be in drug rehabilitation, not available to take the survey. This was the survey, the results of the survey on drug use and health. As you can see, marijuana way out ahead of all of the other drugs. So what causes substance abuse? There are a number of views. We're going to kind of recap into what we've learned earlier in the semester. Subculture view or social disorganization view. Generally the lower class has the addiction. It's based on an environmental basis. There is a disproportionate number of drug abusers that live in poor, deteriorating, depressed areas. These individuals have shared feelings with each other, which those feelings are alienation, hopelessness, low self-esteem, poor socioeconomic status, stress of living in a harsh urban environment. They meet peers in like settings, especially if we're talking about adolescents. They learn the technique of drug use, and they support each other in that use. It's been found that poverty is linked to high level of mistrust and defiance found in these areas. However, there is verifiable data on the relationship between class and crime. However, can be inconclusive because there are folks who are drug abusers who don't fit the economic structure, right? The National Youth Survey found little, if any, association between drug use and social class. And their explanation leaned towards social learning or peer pressure. Adolescent drug abuse is highly correlated to, the behavior of their best friends, especially when parental supervision is weak. Youth's association with friends who are also substance abusers increase the probability of drug use. In fact, drug abusers actually seek out friends who are also abusers. And association with drug abusers increases the risk of drug abuse. Research shows that peer networks may be the most significant influence on long-term substance abuse. Another is family factors, social learning, which I think also relates to peer pressure, kind of one umbrella. So observing parental drug use, another explanation for adolescent drug use and abuse. Specifically, drug users often have poor family life. Studies have shown that the majority of adolescent drug users have an unhappy childhood. They're characterized by harsh punishment and parental neglect. The drug use and family quality connection may involve other differences, race or gender differences. Female and European Americans who suffered abuse as a child were more likely to have alcohol and drug arrests as an adult, while abuse is less likely to affect drug use in males and African Americans. Drug abuse as a result of observing parental drug use may be one of the most important causes, next to peer pressure, of drug abuse than any other family problem, especially if they learn that drugs provide pleasure. Right? It's used for pleasurable sensations. Genetic factors is another explanation. Parental biological heritage. Research shows that biological children of alcoholics raised by non-alcoholic adoptive parents are found to be more likely to develop alcohol problems than natural children of adopted parents. Additionally, identical twins twice as likely as fraternal twins to have similar drug usage issues. And interesting, it has been shown that future substance abuse can be predicted by behavior of a child as early as 6 years of age. Emotional problems as an explanation for drug use among adolescents. Some experts say that emotional problems are the link because emotional problems can strike a child regardless of their economic status. And drug abuse is not solely found in lower class youths that use drugs to help them control or express unconscious needs, and other folks besides youths as well. Just individuals use drugs to help them control or express unconscious needs to reduce feelings or escape from reality or, imagined feelings. Drug abusers often have an addiction-prone personality, which indicates that the cause of substance abuse may be traced to a compulsive need for mood-altering drugs. Research of narcotic abusers suggests a significant percentage suffer from psychotic disorders. Half of all drug abusers may also be diagnosed with anti-personality disorders. So I've tied in the psychological view out of the emotional view together, but these psychological views impair the cognitive function. Problem behavior syndrome. According to problem behavior theory, an adolescent who exhibits problem behaviors or any risk-taking behavior, for example, alcohol and drug use, truancy, delinquency, is said to have problem behavior syndrome. Research suggests that even when an adolescent exhibits only one or two problem behaviors, the likelihood of developing more over time is fairly certain. Substance abuse, just one of the many problems that begin early in life and then persist throughout. Youths who abuse drugs are often maladjusted, emotionally distressed, and suffer from other social problems. And adolescents with problem behavior syndrome can have substance abuse issues, educational underachievement, unemployment, and a higher rate of suicide than adolescents who do not have PBS. And the final theory, rational choice. People choose to use drugs. They weigh the benefits against the costs. The benefits they see, maybe under mistaken belief, they can get high, makes them relax, improves their creativity, lets them escape reality. It increases their sexual responsiveness. So the rational choice theory views the experimental drug use with less concern than those other theories. This theory purports to maintain a realistic perspective on drug use, especially adolescent drug use, as opposed to an overly reactionary negative stance. So could just be based on a choice that they've weighed the options on, and whether their options are a mistaken belief or otherwise, that's the reason why we have drug abuse. Is there a single cause of drug abuse? There's this concept called the pathways to drug abuse. What is the pathway to drug abuse? There is no one way, but generally it starts with a softer drug like alcohol or marijuana, and even the use of nicotine leads to the use and abuse of more dangerous substances. In other words, involvement with soft drugs may serve as a gateway to more harmful drugs. Adolescent drinking with an adult present is a significant precursor of later substance abuse and delinquency. Serious drug users typically started with alcohol, and some research shows those who start with marijuana tend to move on to more dangerous substances. So, what about drugs and crime? Is there a link between drugs and crime, or substance abuse and crime? One of the main reasons for the criminalization of particular substances is a significant association believed to exist between drug abuse and crime. Substance abuse appears to be an important precipitating factor in a variety of criminal acts. Alcohol, for one, is a factor in 40% of all violent crimes. 30% of inmates report that they were drinking at the time of the offense. Research suggests a link between alcohol use and crimes such as domestic assault, armed robbery, and homicide. User surveys indicate that youths who abuse alcohol are most likely to engage in violent behavior in their life course. Efforts to link drug use to crime find that they are highly correlated. Alcohol was implicated in the incarceration of more than half of all inmates in America, while illicit substances implicated 3/4 of incarcerations. Surveys of prison inmates indicate nearly 80% of them are lifelong substance abusers. So what causes this linkage? What are some factors? Well, interferes in socialization, maturity. Drug addiction increases frequency, but not violence of the criminal activity. So while drug addiction might increase criminal acts, it does not necessarily increase to violent criminal behavior. Drug use and criminal behavior share the same roots for impulsiveness and deviant behavior, come from the same origin. Drug use creates the need to finance a drug habit. Criminal deviance increases probability of later drug use. So these are the factors that link in drugs and crime. Number of studies that have been conducted to analyze the association between alcohol and drug abuse and crime. One such study and there's many. One such study is conducted by the National Institute of Justice Arrestee Drug Abuse Monitoring, or ADAM, that tracked the trends in drug abuse among arrestees in urban areas. The most recent report found that almost 60% of males and 30% of females tested positive for marijuana arrestees. With the exception of methamphetamines, males more likely than females to test positive for the use of all other drugs over females. A study conducted by McCurley and Snyder found that higher levels of youth problem behaviors and delinquency, such as school suspension or carrying weapons, are associated with drug use and distribution. For example, students who drank alcohol in the past month were also suspended from school. So there was some link in that behavior. How do we explain drug use and crime? The relationship between crime and drug use, well, has been established by many studies. It is far from certain whether 1, drug use causes crime, 2, crime leads individuals to engage in substance abuse, or 3, both drug abuse and crime are functions of some other factor. Some researchers argue that drugs and crime are associated because both are caused by the same third variables. The data do indicate that drug sales, and criminal behavior share many of the same causes, such as the individual traits, the family problems, the school problems, and association with delinquent peers. Also, some researchers argue that drugs and crime are associated because crime causes drug use or sales. Engaging in crime increases the likelihood that a person will be exposed to others who possess and use drugs, who reinforce drug use, or who hold values conducive to drug use. The data here indicate that crime increases the likelihood of subsequent drug use. At the same time, the evidence suggests that drug use, especially serious drug use, does contribute to crime. For example, although drug addicts typically engage in crime before they became addicts, their level of crime increases during periods of high drug use and decreases during periods of low drug use. Much of the association between drugs and crime arises because both are caused by the same third variable and because crime has an effect on drug use. So that's our overview on the links between substance abuse and drug abuse and crime, whether it's a direct cause, an indirect cause, or caused by some third variable. Obviously, there's research on both sides of the coin, or all three sides of the coin. You make your own assessment on that. What about drugs and the law? Let's talk about the different laws that are for drug prevention and control. Prior to 1907, I'll say 1907, and any and all drugs could be brought and sold in the U.S. without restriction. Manufacturers were not required to disclose the contents of their products. Patent medicines of the time were trade secrets. This came to an end with the Federal Pure Food and Drug Act of 1906. I say 1906 was when the act was created, but it didn't go into place until the 1st of 1907, January 1st, which required manufacturers to list their ingredients and specifically targeted mood-changing chemicals. So that's the first time we see a law with an attempt to regulate drugs. In 1914, the Harrison Narcotics Act restricted the importation and sale of opiates except for medicinal purposes. Narcotics was defined in the statute, was defined as any drug that produces sleep or relieves pain. This, in effect, outlawed street use of these kinds of drugs. However, by 1920, court rulings severely curtailed the use of heroin for medical purposes, claiming that it only caused addiction. In 1937, there was the passage of the Marijuana Tax Act, effectively outlawing marijuana, a federal stance that was reinforced by the Boggs Act of 1951, which provided for mandatory sentences for drug laws. The Boggs Act also mandated deletion of heroin from the list of medically useful substances and required its complete removal from all medicine. In 1970, the federal government enacted the Comprehensive Drug Abuse Prevention and Control Act. There's a title in that act called the Controlled Substance Act, the CSA, and that established categories or schedules of controlled substances. Since then, federal laws were amended to increase penalties for drug possession and trafficking, and the Controlled Substance Act component of the Comprehensive Drug Abuse and Prevention and Control Act was amended in 1984, restructuring the drug categories to 5 categories, which then identified the drugs subject to the federal law. And just to give you a snapshot of these 5 categories, Schedule 1 drugs are the worst case scenario. Schedule 1 drugs, these are drugs, substances, or chemicals that are defined as drugs with no currently accepted medical use, and then they also have a high potential for abuse. That's the highest level. And these schedules are still in place today. This is what we use to prosecute drug crimes. So let me give you some examples of Schedule 1 drugs: heroin, LSD, ecstasy, and marijuana. So marijuana is on the Schedule 1. It's on the top rank. Schedule 2 drugs and substances or chemicals are defined as drugs with a high potential for abuse, with use potentially leading to severe psychological or physical dependence. These drugs are also considered dangerous. Some examples of these drugs: cocaine, methamphetamine, methadone, oxycodone, fentanyl, Adderall, Ritalin. Those are some examples. There's some more, but those are some examples that I believe you'd be familiar with if you've heard the terms. Schedule 3 drugs and substances or chemicals that are defined as drugs with a moderate to low potential for physical and psychological dependence. These drugs, Schedule 3 drugs, abuse potential is less than Schedule 1 and Schedule 2 drugs, but more so than 4 and 5. Some examples of Schedule 3: Tylenol with codeine, antibiotic steroids, anabolic, why am I struggling with that one? Anabolic steroids, and testosterone. All right, Schedule 4 drugs. Substances or chemicals are defined as drugs with a low potential for abuse and a low risk of dependency. Some examples: Valium, Ativan, Ambien, Xanax, Tranvial. Schedule 4 drugs, substances, or chemicals are defined as drugs with lower potential for abuse than Schedule 4 and consist of preparations containing limited quantities of certain narcotics. Some examples are Lyrica and Robitussin AC. So those are Schedule 5. So those are drugs. That's our schedule. There's more drugs defined in each category, but like I said, I just wanted to pick out some that you may be familiar with and where they fell on the list. Anti-Drug Abuse Act of 1986 set forth a strict set of standard minimum and maximum penalties for drug offenses, including the addition of trafficking of large quantities of drugs. The Anti-Drug Abuse Act was amended in 1988, which created a coordinated national drug policy with the goal of a drug-free America. It established the Office of National Drug Control Policy and restored the use of the death penalty by the federal government with regards to many acts, but as it relates to drug, if there was a drug-related killing and you're charged with a federal crime, you could be subject to the death penalty. The change from the Act of 1986 to the Act of 1988 concerns the mandatory minimum penalties to drug trafficking conspiracies and attempts that previously were applicable only to substantive completed drug traffic offenses. So now you can get mandatory penalties in prisons for conspiring to traffic drugs or attempting to do so versus a complete transaction. The act amended the law to make crack cocaine the only drug with a mandatory minimum penalty for a first offense for a simple possession. So, mandatory prison for possessing a small amount of crack cocaine. What types of drug control strategies are in place? Defining drug control solely in legal terms would miss the vast amount of programs and individuals outside of law enforcement working to reduce drug use and drug harms, such as clinicians, street outreach workers, and school teachers. The actual programs to consider may then take many forms, just as many forms as the diversity of markets and participants subject to these controls. Pure strategies of drug law enforcement that focus on drug suppliers need to be considered alongside harm reduction, drug use treatment, or school-based prevention programs. So let's consider these drug control strategies because there's quite a bunch. Source control. This is the law enforcement component, aimed at importation. It's a systematic apprehension of large volume drug dealers, strict enforcement, there's harsh penalties. They make other efforts in attempting to destroy overseas crops. The U.S. government tries to work with overseas farmers and foreign governments and hope to curtail the importation of drugs, but sometimes that doesn't make the cartel happy. So they also try to influence the foreign governments and the farmers, and and they become they could be intimidating, and they fight back. They also will just move on and find another place. These are large amounts of drugs and grown large. The world is a very big place, so they sometimes just move on. So it's hard to keep up with that source. Interception at the borders, interdiction strategies, border control, another name for it, designed to intercept drug suppliers as they enter the country, but only a small percentage is being intercepted. Again, it's hard to control the entire border around the country and catch every single one that comes in. Another border control effort is to target the internet, drug traffickers from foreign countries. Designer drugs sold on the internet, that's problematic. And again, it's hard to detect. But even if all importation of drugs were to cease, homegrown or lab-made drugs, such as marijuana, meth, ecstasy, could then become the primary drug of choice. They're usually easy to get, cheap in making, and that they are very attractive for those reasons. However, law enforcement is making some headway regarding shutting down illegal meth labs, which have been declining over the years. The government seems to cite the new regulations restricting the access to retail sales of the once over-the-counter medicines that contain ingredients for meth. Other efforts targeting the dealers. Efforts focus on drug trafficking and busting large-scale drug rings within the country. Police conduct street-level busts of dealers and users. They're trying to get the kingpin, the supplier. Sometimes, though, this can be too much of a hassle because there's so many more users to gather up. And when they do this big crackdown, it results in 80% increase in violence. Also, drug sweeps have overcrowded correctional facilities because of the mandatory sentencing, and it drains police resources. There's punishment strategies, the deterrence through harsh punishments, prosecutors cracking down on drug dealers, right? As I said, there's mandatory minimums for a lot of these drug possession cases, just possession cases. Forget doing sales, that's even more, and trafficking even more. However, sometimes these cases get backlogged in court. Defense attorneys can drag things out. There's lots of legal maneuvering, and most who end up convicted of a drug crime will either be released early due to overcrowding in the prisons, or placed on probation, again, due to overcrowding in the prisons. Educational programs aimed at reducing kids and teenage substance abuse is another effort to reduce drug use. This happens in schools, and a majority of public schools have implemented drug education programs. It begins in kindergarten, extends through 12th grade. Some of those programs include Project Alert and DARE. I'm sure you're all familiar with DARE. One of the focuses of education strategies is the media's influence on adolescents' intentions to use drugs. According to the National Youth Anti-Drug Media Campaign, most 7th through 12th graders, quote unquote, agree a lot that anti-drug ads make them less likely to try to use drugs, which is a great strategy. But then on the flip side of that, there's media who are constantly influencing the youth, through movies and advertising that attracts the adolescents. So there's kind of a seesaw there. Community strategies is another effort to reduce drug use. Programs reach out to youths who are the highest risk and people who are, I keep focusing on youths because it starts early. I mean, the 12-year-olds using illicit drugs. So the education is, let's get out there early. Programs that reach out directly to youths that are high risk. One of the most successful community-based programs is to prevent substance abuse and delinquency and crime. That's delinquency for the Boys and Girls Club because it's for youths. That gets them out. They're in the community. If they're doing things, good things, they're not distracted or getting involved in drugs. There's a number of programs to educate parents in the community to assist the youth in learning the dangers of drugs and substance abuse, and to steer clear of pressures of use and drug use. Communities provide self-help groups, NA, AA, Alcohol Anonymous, neighborhood watches, watching for drugs being sold or seeing what's going on in the neighborhood, or creating drug-free school zones. Drug testing programs for employees, especially for jobs involving public safety, and drug testing criminal offenders while their case is pending. These things have been believed to deter substance abuse. Treatment strategies, another effort to reduce drug use for criminal offenders that are, there's drug courts that specialize in treatment and rehabilitation versus going through the court system and then being incarcerated at the end. If you complete a treatment program, then that's going to be extremely helpful for resolving your case in a non-punitive way. Several approaches that are available to treat users. There's a multi-systemic therapy, MST. I was trying to think what the MST stood for that I had written in my notes, which involves addressing a variety of family, peer, and psychological problems by focusing on problem solving and not just community communication skills, but family communication skills in general. They may help provide housing, especially for drug abusers who are homeless. And they help with all of their immediate needs in order to be able to work on and focus on, I don't want to say solving the drug abuse, but helping them to kick the drug abuse, the drug problem. There's outdoor activities, wilderness training. These programs are based on an Alcoholics Anonymous philosophy that users must find the strength to stay clean and that support from others, from those who understand their experiences, that can be useful in their success in achieving a drug-free life. Residential programs, then, are for serious drug abusers, which involve a more comprehensive form of treatment that can include detoxification, counseling, hypnosis, and other forms of therapy. And one last approach that kind of ties in with the treatment strategies is harm reduction, which makes drug treatment facilities readily available without the fear of punishment for anyone who wishes to overcome their habit and live a drug-free life. They don't necessarily have to be in trouble with the law. Health professionals administer drugs to addicts as part of a treatment and detoxification program, like a needle exchange programs, slows the transmission of diseases, and methadone maintenance to assist heroin users. It's supposed to satisfy cravings, has been shown to reduce illegal heroin use and criminal activity. So that's another type of program. Employment programs. I almost forgot the employment programs. Vocational rehabilitation and work support programs have been established. The research shows that drug abusers who obtain and keep employment are likely to end or reduce their the incidence of their substance abuse. So, and additionally, these employment programs help with job training skills, interviewing techniques, overcoming barriers to employment, as well as personal issues. All right, one final note here. Legalization of drugs. Should we or should it not be legalized? What does the future hold? The U.S. appears to be willing to go to great lengths to keep fighting the drug war, spending well over $1 trillion so far. Enforcement costs, drug control, federal and state level, throwing the costs of court and prosecuting drug crimes. But we also noted strict enforcement leads to overcrowded prisons. In some jurisdictions, 2/3 of cases are drug cases, and those have mandatory minimum prison terms for most drug offenses. Prevention, deterrence, and treatment strategies according to some criminologists, ignore the core reason for the majority of drug problems, which are deemed to believe poverty, alienation, family disruption. So some are calling for the legalization of drugs. And I just want to point out, decriminalization, legalization, two different things. Decriminalization typically reduces criminal penalties associated with the personal possession of controlled substance. Legalization eliminates the laws and associated criminal penalties that prohibit its production, sale, distribution, and possession. Decriminalization enhances personal freedoms in the face of state control, whereas legalization is aimed in part at reducing the control that criminals have over the drug trade. So, other arguments for legalization, meaning getting rid of the rules. In a free society, people should be permitted to do what they want as long as they don't hurt others. Keeping drugs illegal means that they will continue to be high-priced commodities. Legalizing them could greatly lower the price and make them taxable, providing the states with much-needed revenue. The expense of illicit drugs, kept artificially high by their illegal status, encourages the commission of many drug-related crimes, such as prostitution, robbery, burglary. This is what users do to feed their habit. Legalizing drugs would reduce the influence of criminal cartels. The illegal status and associated high cost of drugs indirectly victimize others, such as property owners in drug-infested areas and taxpayers who foot the enforcement bill. Drug legalization would dramatically reduce the opportunity for official corruption, which is now frequently associated with the illicit drug trade. The legalization of drugs would allow for better control over public health issues related to drug use. The spread of AIDS, for example, caused in large part by the use of dirty needles in heroin. Using needles in heroin injection could be better controlled if sterilized needles were made legally available. Similarly, drug quality and potency could be monitored and ensured. And of course, there's always the opponents. Opponents of drug legalization argue that reducing official control over psychoactive substances is immoral, is socially irresponsible, and result in heightened cost to society for drug abuse. Drug legalization would simply increase the types of problems now associated with alcohol abuse, such as lost time from work, drug-induced criminality, the loss of personal self-control, and the serving of important social relationships. The fact that laws are not easily enforceable is no reason to eliminate them, according to the opposing view. So whatever you decide or think about it in general, or maybe just certain types of drugs, as you know, lots of states are passing laws legalizing marijuana in some instances and more lax than others, from medical use or recreational use. Canada is allowing for its full use recreational and on at a federal level. Here in the United States, the feds have not gotten on board with legalizing any drug. So there are small movements, only the future can tell, with regards to legalization of drugs. So this ends our semester material. There isn't any new material after this. The next component will be the exam and the final paper.